every day for our goats we give them fresh branches from around the place. These are bamboo from the garden. Over there we have arundo grass, which I love. Yeah, this is going to go in the chipper, mixed in with some of the gorse. And the benefit that the goats bring into what we feed them is that they remove a lot of the leaves, which have a bit too much nitrogen content for the mix. We put all what we've just chipped into these sacks, and they go into the bathtub for 2 hours at about 70 to 80 degrees, and tie them shut at the top with a little bit of harakeke flax. And yeah, so tomorrow we'll be doing the mixing. This is where we do our sterilization and pasteurization on the farm. So this is an milk vat that's been cut in half. Because we're a big farm, we have a lot of tea tree regeneration, and it's always dying around the place. So that's a fuel source that we use. It's just one of the other ways that we try and reduce our carbon footprint. In the process of running the bath, we also get a yield of biochar. So when we've reached the temperature that we want, in this case 42 degrees for bathing, or in mushroom substrate case 80 degrees, all the leftover charcoal, instead of letting it go all the way to ash, which is not what we want biochar, we do a bit of quenching, so often using liquid that we have stored there. And basically biochar is a soil element, which we'll be covering in other episodes, so I won't do that now, but this is one of the ways that we extract it in the path of doing something else. And all the water afterwards we then use in the greenhouse for watering. So we're recycling a lot of the nutrients that are lost out of the gorse in the process of pasteurization. So these sacks we put in last night. They've been in all night, and we heated the water up to 80 degrees, and that's enough to kill all the mycelium that was on the gorse beforehand. And now we're going to be introducing mycelium. The only possible contaminant we might have is spores. So what we're going to do is we limit as much air to get into this, so this is why the lid's still on. So our biggest issue generally is a green mold, which is trichoderma, and that's just a much more successful fungus that can come in from a spore and sometimes outcompete the mycelium that we're putting in. So we found that the trichoderma fungus can't tolerate as alkaline an environment as oyster mycelium can. That's the reason that a lot of people also sterilize their mix with an alkaline solution, which is a different way of doing it than heating it. We've just decided to do a bit of a hybrid, so we do hot water, but also just do a little bit of ash from the fire that we use. And that slightly more alkaline environment seems to reduce our issues with trichoderma. So this is the way that we get our oyster spawn, and we multiply it in a flow cabinet in a sterilized environment and produce these multiplications. So this just limits the amount of air that gets in, less contamination and so on, and less plastic use. So this bathtub is very simple technology. It does the job. We've never needed to do anything else, so we've not upgraded it. It gets washed out with the sterile water. These buckets we've had about 15 years, so this is just us trying to stay away from anything like single-use plastic bags, which the larger scale mushroom growers use. So in order to sort of stay on a semi-sterile condition for where we need it to be with these mushroom growing operations, we just do a little bit of a spray with iodine just to kind of eliminate any airborne contaminants that come in. So efficiency is the key really in these systems. So we've got one person mixing and one person adding the mycelium spawn to the mix. And we do 2 additions, so one mix, flattening out, adding a handful or 2, another mix, and then doing the same and another mix. And that's just to maximize perfect distribution. And we mark that with also 2 handfuls of ash in the process of mixing, just to remember that when we've done an addition or not. And the ratio basically is you want 3% of the mycelium grain spawn to your substrate that's your growing medium. So after Sean's mixed that and spread it out, I add a handful and then a handful of ash, and then I let Sean do another mix. Now we're ready for the mix to go into our grow bucket. One of the biggest issues for your growing substrate is anaerobic situations. So normally if you're growing on anything like straw, you don't want to over compress the buckets because that can lead to anaerobic conditions. But we found that because the gorse has such a widespread shape with a thorn system that it has, we've never had an anaerobic situation, so you can press down quite strongly into the bucket to make it pack down as well as possible. And that prevents the buckets from drying out, which is the other potential issue. When the bucket is finished, we add a little bit of extra spawn on the top, and that's because that's the biggest area for any competition to come in, and this just means that that gets colonized the first and fastest. So the last touch, as we have all these makeup pads, they're just simple cotton makeup pads, and we just load them up with a little bit of spawn and stuff them into the holes just to create a seal in the early stages of growing. Our buckets are most vulnerable in the first week when there hasn't been a full colonization from the oyster mushroom mycelium yet. Once you see a white film growing everywhere, we'll show you some up at the grow room, then it's pretty well established and there's nothing that can really get in anymore until it's getting to the tail end of its life. And then you get sometimes trichoderma having a bit of a foothold and starting out. So getting rid of old buckets fast is also a good way to keep a healthy population. These buckets will take about 2 weeks to fully colonize and 3 weeks until they start producing the first flushes of mushrooms. And that basically is dictated on the amount of spawn that you're adding to the buckets. The more you add, the faster the colonization happens. And the point at which it starts producing mushrooms, which we call fruit bodies, is when the entire growing medium has been colonized and the mushroom is thinking about its exit strategy out to colonize new terrain. So the moment that the whole bucket is fully colonized is when you start getting fruit bodies forming. And that's about 3 weeks from now. But that can vary depending on the size of the bucket and the amount of spawn that you're adding to the bucket. Here we are inside our grow room. It's basically just a shadier version of a seedling raising greenhouse. Essentially you can have your mushrooms anywhere that's got a certain amount of light. Ideally you have enough light that you could read a newspaper by, and a sort of stable temperature, so not too hot and not too cold. Too cold would restrict the growth, and too hot might end up drying out your substrate. Here we've got a really nice flush of the pink oyster mushrooms, just another variety from the grey, which we have here, and the blue, which we're not currently growing. So when we're harvesting, we just come in with a knife and gently cut them off at the stem. So essentially this whole bucket is one organism. They're all a clone of themselves. It's a mycelium clone. It's a section of mycelium taken which then reproduces and colonizes the entire bucket. And what we see here is a fruit body. So underneath here is where eventually you would get loads of spores building up, and then a cloud of white spores will fly around to colonize new terrain. So this is basically a symptom of the bucket being full, and these fruit bodies are coming out looking to colonize a new place by sending out their spores, and this is what we eat. Basically we just harvest these and we sell them at the local growers market. It's a modest little side income, and we find that if we maintain our growing operation under a certain size, we have no issues with pests. One of the big issues with commercial growing is that they end up using climate controlled grow rooms, so usually a container, and that then basically allows them to have a bit more predictability of when the growth flushes come. The downside with that is they use a lot of energy in the process of using air conditioners and so on and so forth, and obviously they use a high turnover of plastic bags as well. So we try and just keep our operation within a certain limit, and that's worked for us, and we're quite happy with our results from a low level inputs. When we're done with these buckets, we bring them down here or into our compost toilet and basically let the goats break them into the bedding. And this is incredibly dead, dry and spongy material now. All the carbon, all the nitrogen has been removed, and we're left with just the cell structure of the wood, so the lignin and so on. And this will soak up all the urine and all the nitrogen basically from the goats, and that is just a good way of reducing the smell and the runoff that we get from our stables, and a good way of just cycling everything back into the system.